So I recently had a request over Patreon to make a video on the subject of trauma and how trauma, particularly that accrued during childhood, can actually affect the development of our cognitive functions. And while I'm going to, of course, resist making any blanket statements on this subject, there is one particular trend that stands out to me. And this is the trend whereby people essentially retreat into the confines of the dominant stack and develop a very antagonistic relationship with their opposing functions. And as such, the dominant stack often serves as a kind of sanctum for the self. And again, speaking in generalizations, as a result of this, the introverted personalities tend to retreat further into themselves and abstaining from an interaction with the external world, whereas the extroverted personalities tend to retreat more outwardly and engage in such activities that essentially inhibit an internal dialogue. However, it will be a horrendous simplification to therefore assume that all extroverted personalities in response to trauma are going to be more sociable. This is nonsense. Socialization is only a small portion of what it means to be an extrovert, and it depends completely upon the functions involved in the dominant stack. For example, in the case of an ENTP, let's say they suffered a bit during childhood, they would tend to develop a persona which relies heavily upon the affirmation of other people. That's such while the introverted thinking, introverted sensing is still very powerful within this particular individual, it will seldom be employed in a convergent manner because the convergence, again the attitude of the ego complex, is solely occupied with acquiring affirmation from other people. However, in the case of a traumatized ENTJ, for example, this could go either way. They could solely occupy themselves with the extrovert thinking component and therefore pour themselves into their work. And the more they can pour themselves into this work, the less they have to engage in any kind of internal emotional dialogue. And therefore it will very much be a perpetual escape from that place where their pain resides. Alternatively, an ENTJ may dip into extroverted feeling and thus surround themselves with other people and rely upon the affirmation of other people to the same extent as a traumatized ENTP. But again, in this instance, entirely to escape an introverted feeling dialogue. But in the case of introverts, for example, an INFJ, in response to trauma, an INFJ may overly engage their introverted intuition, introverted thinking, and dip into introverted feeling from that position, in a perpetual escape from that concrete world which has caused so much pain in the first place. And as such, even though extroverted feeling will still very much be an authoritative driving force behind this individual, the person will have a very ambivalent relationship with this function. And it'll never be engaged in a convergent manner because, again, convergence is the attitude of the ego complex, and the ego complex in this instance is residing entirely within the confines of an introverted intuitive dominant stack. Whereas the INFJ will still have a primarily cerebral center, the traumatized introverted feeling dominant will instead run away into their own emotions. And suddenly their emotions have an intrinsic value and no longer have to be rationalized or justified with logic. And in this instance, all external hierarchies, all frameworks become the enemy. And as such, this individual can very much develop not only a victim complex, but also an entitlement complex too. Because they are averse, they are running away from those systems, those skill sets, those frameworks that are necessary in order to acquire the limbic resonance they want to find in reality. And very loosely speaking again, INTPs will become overly cerebral, completely detached from their own emotional dialogue. ESTJs will become obsessively controlling and manipulative. ESFJs, ENFJs, for example, may become overly people-pleasing or perhaps overly religious in their attitudes, or overly judgmental of anyone who does not fall within the confines of their immediate community. And conversely, extroverted sensing dominance will be perpetually running away from any kind of abstract thought, whereas introverted sensing dominance will be staying solely within the confines of their safe space. And this general trend goes as follows. The ego complex resides within a dominant stack. Therefore, the function most opposing the dominant function, the oppositional function, becomes subdued. And therefore, this is the function that the person seeks to escape from. And this also applies to the reverse orientation of that function, and therefore an extroverted intuitive dominant in this instance will not be dipping into extroverted sensing, the introverted intuitive dominant will not be dipping into introverted sensing, the introverted thinking dominant will not be dipping into introverted feeling, and the extroverted thinking dominant will not be dipping into extroverted feeling, and so on. And as such, a completely subdued oppositional function actually has more than one implication. Furthermore, the authority function of any given type, while still remaining very powerful, very strong, and oftentimes very effective, will remain in a perpetually divergent state. And therefore any individual will develop a very antagonistic relationship with that function because as much as they obey it, as much as they heed its counsel, they will never ever take responsibility for it. A traumatized ENTJ, for example, will never be able to handle or cope with any kind of disruption of their plans, however small those plans might be. and they will develop a kind of victim mentality as a result of this. A traumatized INTP will not only be completely oblivious to the emotions of other people, but also oblivious to their own emotional dialogue and the way in which their emotions are actually propelling forward their own cognitive bias. A traumatized INFJ or even INTJ will be in a perpetual escape from external reality and even prioritizing their own inner sanctum as even more real than reality itself. A traumatized INFJ will tend to retreat into this kind of moral frameworking whereby they make up for their lack of convergent extroverted feeling with this overly righteous system of how they think every single person should be conducting themselves. And again, all the while abstaining from any kind of influence upon an extroverted feeling atmosphere, any kind of responsibility for that which they seem to consecrate so much. A traumatized INTJ will be overly consecrating systems, frameworks, hierarchies, qualifications, all the while abstaining from any kind of acquisition or interaction with these things that they hold dear. A traumatized ENTP will be seeking affirmation from other people, all the while being unable to develop the skill set that they need to in order to actually acquire this affirmation in the first place. The list goes on and on. But as a traumatized individual tends not to employ the authority function in a convergent manner, any kind of convergent interaction with this function tends to be done through its opposite orientation. And this is where the traumatized ENTP tends to overly fetishize the external object, especially when that external object can be a conduit towards affirmation. The traumatized ENTJ, for as much as they hate the idea of taking responsibility for their internal vision and learning to compromise and reform it according to the external circumstances, will still be very willing to experiment with the external world, experiment and find new connections within the external atmosphere. A traumatized ISFJ, for example, will still be very willing to consult their own introverted feeling and mold their own identity around their own trauma. And again, the traumatized ESFP will oftentimes be incredibly sociable, incredibly able to dip into extroverted feeling from an extroverted thinking standpoint. And this convergent dip into the opposite orientation of the divergent auxiliary function very much serves the agenda of this expeditious retreat away from the opposing stack. Because in this instance of trauma, one does not simply run away from these opposing functions, but also the orientation of these functions. And as such, the traumatized INFJ will not only be running away from extroverted sensing and extroverted feeling, they will also be running away from extroverted intuition and extroverted thinking. It's all of the extroverted domain to the introvert that becomes threatening, just as it is all of the introverted dialogue to the extrovert that becomes threatening. And as such, this primary response to trauma tends to overdevelop the functions of the same orientation to the dominant stack at the expense of all of the functions of the opposing orientation to the dominant stack. And the earlier this trauma is incurred and the earlier this agenda of cognitive function development begins, the harder it can be to escape from this vicious cycle. And I cannot emphasize enough that to escape any one of these given cycles, the interaction with other people of different walks of life is absolutely essential, especially if one of these people consecrate a function that you are running away from. And while this egocentric response to trauma is by far the most common, there are two other very basic responses which I will now gloss over. One of these responses is the over-identification with an extreme of any given codec. For example, one person who's been traumatized can over-identify with this hyper-cerebralism, this over-reliance upon a very extreme employment of a thinking function. And as such, this over-reliance on objective logic serves to detach the person from any kind of feeling dialogue. And while this can overlap with the egocentric trauma, for example, introverted thinking dominance, any given person, even an introverted feeling dominant, can overly consecrate and overly identify with the extreme employment of a thinking codec. And in this instance, no matter what your type is, you'll be relying so much on what you perceive to be entirely logical objective data that you consistently fail to employ feeling to any sufficient degree as to allow yourself to change any of these logical frameworks that you have unconsciously, unknowingly become attached to on a limbic introverted feeling level. This hyper-rationalism allows the person to completely detach from their emotions and even allow the perception of self as one who is completely above trauma in the first place. But it is nothing more than a delusion. And on the reverse end of the spectrum, somebody can overly identify with their feelings. Their feelings have an intrinsic value. They become the victim of life. They become overly entitled. Things should just bend around their will. Their desires are all that matters. Their feelings and sensitivity are the sum of reality itself. And when things do not go their way, they become the victim of other people. And they will employ that victimhood as a kind of leverage to get other people to continue treating them in a way that they want to be treated. And again, in this instance, this hyper-subjective logic, there's a complete abstinence from any kind of convergent thinking employment, all the while holding on for dear life to various moral frameworks, heuristics and such, that are intrinsically connected to an introverted thinking protocol that they have absolutely no control of or no responsibility for. And the final response to trauma is one in which you essentially model yourself on another person. You model yourself on an archetype. You model yourself on what you believe you are expected to be by any given subculture you have chosen to become a part of. And in many instances, an individual may actually associate a certain function's employment more with that subculture, more with that archetype or identity than other functions. And this kind of pathology does often occur in response to trauma, especially that trauma accrued in earlier years, because it is in these formative years when we are constructing and taking responsibility for our identity that we tend to look for archetypes, that we tend to look for various idols to impart to us a blueprint on which to construct this identity in the first place. And as such, even say somebody who doesn't necessarily instinctively prioritize a thinking function to the same extent as, say, a thinking dominant, if they choose to model themselves at an early age upon an archetype or a character, fictional or otherwise, this will become an albeit more indirect means of trauma essentially forcing the person to essentially overnight rush the completion of an identity journey that should usually span multiple years. And this is when human beings do become a bit ridiculously stereotypical. This is when an individual does seem like they're constantly putting on this act, because it is this very act, this mask that they are wearing, that they believe to be the only thing standing between themselves, their raw, vulnerable core self, and the torment and pain that lies within the real world. And the cognitive function which is overemphasized here, and the cognitive functions which is subsequently underutilized, or even run away from, completely and utterly depend upon the archetype this person was essentially forced to construct overnight. So thank you so much to my Patreon Sarah for that request. I hope people found that interesting. I'd absolutely love to know what your own response is to pain. How do you feel your cognitive functions respond to various stressful experiences? If you haven't already done so, make sure to click that subscribe button down below with the bell icon next to it. That way you can stay notified of future content. So I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.